When people mention Masonic conspiracies, they're usually some obscure master plan for world domination or totalitarian control over the masses. Rarely does anyone address historical conspiracy. And when someone may address the conspiracies throughout history, the influence of the Freemasons may only be a footnote. But the Grand Lodge of England, Oriental Freemasonry of France, and Prince Hall Freemasonry in the United States have been key players in the manipulation of world history. Everett argues that 6 of these Indians were then sold at the estate sales, and that at least 6 more were unambiguously slaves delivered and sold as merchandise and bequeathed in perpetuity to estate heirs through their last wills. He notes that while 28 Indian slaves might not sound like a large number, but 28 Indian slaves actually exceeded the figure for all Africans living in Virginia at the time. 28 Indian slaves actually exceeded the figure for all Africans living in Virginia at the time. Just to make sure you understand that. And those Africans that they're saying live in Virginia were most likely not African. They were most likely taken from the Caribbean, and they were probably taken from South America or somewhere in the Americas and transported to the Caribbean, including the Carolinas, because as we can see and as we've gone over, we know their mode of operation. We know their patterns. The colonists engaged in 3 Indian wars from 1610 to 1646, in which enslavement was considered a proper punishment for captives. Virginia also exported some captive Indians, and Everett suggests that this proves that there is an existing external market for Indian slaves in other countries and the Caribbean. Of course, he claims, I also want to say this, that in addition to the Caribbean, we also can see that these Indian slaves were taken where? To Europe, specifically England, to be sold as slaves. He claims that the market to sell Indians as slaves could have added a financial incentive in addition to other motives for colonial Indian wars. Numerous Virginia Indians were enslaved and exported during the Third Anglo-Powhatan War in 1644 to 1646. Historian Jane Guild asserts that the 1655 Act also prevented colonists from treating Indian children as slaves, even if they were being held as colonial hostages. Notably, she also states that this act is the first use of the word slave in any Virginian legislation. It is interesting and illuminating that the first appearance of the word slave in a Virginian law concerned Indians. Who is this white man standing behind Marcus Garvey? For those of you who don't know, this is Walter Plecker. He's best known for being an extreme eugenicist, racist, who believed black people were inferior to whites. He especially hated Indians who had not lost their tribal identity, and those Indians who refused to be labeled black or African. Plecker hated Indians. Of course, Garvey, on the other hand, was a Pan-Africanist who promoted the idea that America was a white man's country and all so-called blacks should go back to Africa, where they're supposedly from. So even though they occupied the same space on opposite ends of the racial spectrum, their objectives ran hand in hand. Plecker ordered state agencies to reclassify most citizens who claimed American Indian identity as colored Once again, Plecker ordered state agencies to reclassify most citizens who claimed American Indian identity as colored, although many Virginia Native Americans continued to live in their communities and maintain their tribal practices. Church records, for instance, continued to identify them as Native Americans. Specifically, Plecker had ordered the agencies to reclassify certain families who he identified by surname because he decided they were trying to pass and evade segregation. This remained legal in the South until federal legislation overturned it in the 60s. So what he was really trying to do was not just prevent some sort of miscegenation law based off the one drop rule, one drop of Negro blood. Honestly, what he was trying to do was keep any Indian from being recognized as Native American. You weren't segregated to the colored only section, right? Because this is about segregation in the Jim Crow South. This mainly was to keep mulattoes from passing as white officially. So on the census, he made sure to classify race as either white or black, and then determine the rules by which one would be considered white or black. Unlike freed slaves, the majority of free blacks could either choose to leave America or remain. Therefore, changes in the rate of freeborn immigration can serve as an indicator of both black attitudes toward colonization and the conditions in America as they affected black people. And he didn't mention this, but possibly what them niggas had heard about Liberia. Because if you knew 10 niggas who went to Liberia and half of them died, hey man, how was Liberia? Well shit, half of us dead now. Oh, for real? It doesn't bode well for future opportunities in Liberia. In 1860, between a fourth and a third of the whole free colored population lived in towns and cities. In some counties, a large proportion of black inhabitants were free. In Accomack County, 3,392 of the 8,000 black inhabitants were free. In James City County, 926 out of 2,764 blacks were free. In Nansemond County, there were 2,470 free Negroes and 581 slaves. Other counties in Tidewater in which from 1/6 to 1/2 of the colored population was free were Charles City, Fairfax, Henrico, Isle of Wight, James City, Norfolk, Northampton, Prince William, Richmond, Southampton, Warwick, and Westmoreland. The counties in the Piedmont which had the largest free colored population relative to the slave class were Loudoun and Goochland. In the former, 1/6 of the Negroes were free, in the latter, 1/9. So they're telling you that there were not only free Negroes in Virginia, there were large populations in counties of free Negroes that even would dwarf the slave population. What they're also telling you is that there are large populations of free Negroes in these very same early colonized areas in Virginia that are larger than the so-called slave population. So we can see here that these groups of free blacks weren't taken from Africa. These were quote unquote Indians reclassified as free Negroes or free blacks who had in some way become friendly and or tributary to the crown, in which they were not hostile and allowed to operate freely in the state of Virginia. And this quote comes from the Free Negro in Virginia, 1619 to 1865.